Somewhere on the western edge of Britain, where the mountains fold into the sea, there is a country that has spent centuries being explained by other people. The English called it the West. Historians called it Celtic. Tourists called it ancient. And the Welsh called it home. For a long time, that seemed simple enough. Wales was the place where the old Britons survived. The place where a language older than English kept breathing in chapels, coal towns, schools and villages. The place pushed toward the edge of the island by conquest, but never fully absorbed by it. That was the story. And it was not wrong. The Welsh language really is a Celtic language. More specifically, it belongs to the Brythonic group, descended from the older British language, once spoken across much of Britain before English became dominant across most of the island. But language was only the first clue. Because when scientists finally began mapping the DNA of Britain in fine detail, Wales did not appear as a simple romantic survival on the edge of the map. It appeared as something more complicated, something more regional, something that did not fit neatly inside the labels people had been using for centuries. The old word was Celtic. The new evidence was genetic. And the two did not line up as cleanly as many people expected. So what if the Welsh were not simply one branch of a single Celtic family? What if Wales preserved a stronger signal from older layers of Britain than most of the island around it? Start with the version most people know. Before there was England, before there was a single political Wales, Britain was a patchwork of peoples, tribes, languages, and local worlds. The Romans arrived in Britain in the 1st century AD. They began their conquest of what is now Wales in AD 47, and it took them until about AD 78 to complete it. Roman military and political power remained part of the landscape until the beginning of the 5th century. But Wales was never simply swallowed whole. The land itself made that difficult. The mountains of Eryri in the north, the Cambrian mountains through the middle, the broken coastline, the valleys that could connect communities, but also separate them. Wales was not an island, but it often behaved like a set of internal worlds divided by ridges, rivers, passes, and distance. The Romans built forts. They built roads. They brought soldiers, trade, taxes, and Latin inscriptions. And still, after Rome, the older British language world did not disappear from this western part of the island. That is the first pattern that matters. Wales was not untouched. It was touched again and again by Rome, by Christianity, by Anglo-Saxon kingdoms pressing from the east, by Norman castles, by English law, by industrial capitalism. The Welsh were not frozen in time. That is too simple. But they were also not erased. And that is where the story begins to get strange. For centuries, the easiest explanation was geography. Wales survived because of mountains. Wales kept its language because it was remote. Wales remained different because it was hard to conquer, hard to cross, hard to fully control. There is truth in that. But mountains alone do not preserve a people. They slow armies. They shape roads. They make central power expensive. But they do not stop trade, marriage, ambition, religion, money, or the quiet pressure of a neighboring language spoken by people with more political power. If geography were enough, many more places would have stayed exactly as they were. Wales did not. It changed constantly. And yet, some line of continuity remained. The clue was not just in old poems or ruined forts. It was not only in place names, beginning with Llan, Aber, Pen, and Tre. It was not only in the sound of Cymreg, the Welsh language still spoken after centuries of pressure. The clue was hidden in DNA. In 2015, researchers published one of the most detailed genetic maps ever made of the British Isles. The project used 2,039 samples from rural areas. The researchers did not simply test anyone who happened to live in a place. They looked for people whose 4 grandparents had all been born near one another, within 80 kilometers, or about 50 miles. That mattered because grandparents carried the genetic geography of a less mobile Britain before modern mobility blurred the map. The researchers analyzed hundreds of thousands of positions across the genome and compared British samples with DNA from 6,209 people from across Europe. When the results came back, Britain did not appear as one smooth genetic landscape. It separated into regional patterns. 17 distinct genetic clusters appeared, and Wales did not vanish into a general Celtic fringe. It stood apart, not as a frozen remnant, and not as a people untouched by history, but as one of the clearest signs that Britain's past had been more regional, more layered, and more complicated than the old labels suggested. That was the moment the old story began to crack. Not collapse. Crack. Because the DNA was not saying Welsh identity was fake. It was saying the opposite. It was saying that history had left a pattern in the body. But it was also saying something more unsettling. The Welsh were not less Welsh than people thought. They were harder to simplify. The mystery was not whether Wales was ancient. The mystery was what kind of ancient it was. The first surprise was not that Wales was different. People already knew that. You could hear it in the language. You could see it in the place names. You could feel it in the way the country seemed to hold its own shape against the larger island around it. The surprise was that DNA made some of those differences visible. When the people of the British Isles researchers sorted their samples, Wales did not simply blend into a broad western edge of Britain. At the next level of separation, Wales formed its own distinct genetic group. Then, even inside Wales, the map divided again, with a clear split between north and south. That detail matters, because it means Welsh difference was not only a border story. It was not just Wales against England. It was also Wales within itself. Older regions, older kingdoms, older patterns of marriage and movement had left traces that were still readable centuries later. The researchers noted that this north-south divide corresponded well with two old Welsh kingdoms, Gwynedd in the north and Dyfed in the south. That does not mean medieval kingdoms somehow created the DNA map by themselves. The safer reading is subtler. Political borders, family networks, language communities, and local marriage patterns can sometimes preserve older regional structure for a very long time. That is the part that stops the story from being simple. For generations, people used the word Celtic as if it explained everything. The Welsh were Celtic. The Scots were Celtic. The Irish were Celtic. The Cornish were Celtic. It sounded like one ancient family, pushed west and north by later invaders, surviving in fragments around the Atlantic edge. But the DNA did not show one Celtic people. It showed the opposite. The so-called Celtic parts of the United Kingdom turned out to be some of the most genetically different from one another. Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Cornwall did not form a single biological group. Cornwall, often imagined as part of the same Celtic fringe, was found to be genetically closer to other English groups than to the Welsh or the Scots. That does not mean Celtic identity is fake. It means Celtic is not a blood type. It is a language family, a cultural inheritance, a set of histories, stories, symbols, and memories that move through people in ways DNA does not always follow. And that is where the old picture begins to change. If you were taught that the Welsh were simply Celts, the genetics does not destroy that idea. It makes it less comfortable. It asks a harder question. What were people calling Celtic in the first place? If stories like this are why you watch, the moments where history, DNA, and identity stop lining up neatly, take a second to subscribe. It helps us keep digging into the evidence behind the stories people thought were already settled. Because once the word Celtic becomes less certain, the real question gets older. Not who were the Celts, but who was already here. Pull back from medieval Wales for a moment. Pull back from castles, kings, poems, and borders. Britain itself is not one ancient layer. It is a stack of them. After the last ice age ended about 11,700 years ago, hunter-gatherers lived in and moved through Britain as the climate warmed and the landscape changed. Around 6,000 years ago, farming populations arrived, with ancestry ultimately linked to people from Anatolia, in the region of modern Turkey. They brought agriculture, new tools, new ways of living, and the Neolithic world that built monuments like Stonehenge. Then, around 4,400 years ago, another major transformation arrived. People associated with the beaker culture. They came into Britain from continental Europe carrying high levels of steppe-related ancestry and new technologies associated with the early Bronze Age. Ancient DNA studies suggest that within a few hundred years of this migration, only about 10% of Britain's gene pool came from the earlier Neolithic farming population. Think about that for a second. A large share of an island's ancestry changed or was heavily overwritten in just a few centuries. That is not a footnote. That is a genetic earthquake. And it happened long before the Romans, long before the Anglo-Saxons, long before anyone in Britain was speaking English, long before Wales existed as a country. So when modern Welsh DNA appears more similar to the earlier settlers of Britain after the last Ice Age than other people in the UK, it does not mean the Welsh are unchanged Ice Age people. That would be wrong. Every population in Britain is mixed, layered and changed, but it does mean Wales kept a stronger signal from older parts of the island's story, a signal that later migrations blurred more heavily elsewhere. The old question had been, why did Wales remain different? The better question was becoming, different from which layer of Britain? Because Britain was not replaced once. It was rewritten many times. The next layer was not hidden in prehistory. It was visible on the ground. Borders do not usually begin as clean lines. They begin as pressure. A kingdom expands. A road is built. A language becomes useful. A market pulls one valley east and another valley west. Over time, those pressures harden into habits. Then habits become families. Then families become patterns. In Wales, some of those patterns lasted far longer than anyone expected. Along the eastern side of the country, one of the most famous signs of that pressure is Offa's Dyke, the great earthwork traditionally linked to Offa, king of Mercia, in the second half of the 8th century. With gaps, it runs for about 169 miles, or 270 kilometers, and for centuries it helped mark the divide between English and Welsh worlds. But the genetic map revealed something even more precise. In southwest Pembrokeshire, researchers found evidence of the Lanska Line, the old boundary between English-speaking communities in what became known as Little England beyond Wales, and Welsh-speaking communities farther north and east. That line lasted almost 1,000 years. Think about what that means. A language boundary became visible in DNA. Not because language changes genes, it does not, but because language shapes who meets, who marries, and which communities remain socially close enough to become family. That was the deeper lesson. The Welsh story was never only about mountains. It was never only about invasion. It was about the slow power of boundaries people lived inside every day. And those boundaries mattered because the rest of Britain kept changing. In eastern, central and southern England, the people of the British Isles study estimated Anglo-Saxon ancestry at roughly 10 to 40%. That does not mean the earlier population vanished. It means the eastern side of Britain absorbed a major new layer after the Roman period, while Wales and some other western and northern regions carried much less of that same genetic signal. Again, the point is not purity. Purity is the wrong word for human history. Every population is mixed. Every identity is layered. Every border leaks. The Welsh were shaped by Rome, by Christianity, by Norman lordships, by English law, by coal, slate, migration, industry, poverty, politics, schools, and the modern state. Wales was not preserved under glass. But some things did hold. The language held. Not everywhere. Not evenly. Not without damage. In the 2021 census, about 538,000 people aged 3 or older in Wales reported that they could speak Welsh. That was 17.8% of the population, down from 19% in 2011. Those numbers are not romantic. They show pressure. They show loss. They show a language still alive, but still fighting for space in Wales, and yet that survival still matters. Because Welsh is not just a way of saying the same things with different sounds. It is a memory system. It holds place names, family names, hymns, prayers, protest songs, road signs, and kitchen conversations. It carries a version of Britain that English did not fully replace. So ask yourself this: if a language can survive conquest, law, shame, migration, schools, and centuries of pressure, what exactly is it carrying besides words? This is where the DNA becomes more than science. The genetic evidence did not reveal a secret race hiding in the mountains. It did not prove that the Welsh were untouched, or pure, or separate from the rest of Britain in some absolute way. That would be a fantasy, and a dangerous one. What it revealed was more human. Wales kept patterns, regional patterns, family patterns, language patterns. Ancient signals blurred elsewhere, but still readable here. The story was not a sealed bloodline. It was continuity under pressure. That is harder to explain than a myth. But it is also more interesting. The Welsh were never simply the last Celts of Britain, waiting unchanged at the edge of the island. They were not a museum piece. They were not an untouched tribe. They were the result of deep ancestry, local marriage, hard geography, border pressure, cultural memory, and survival through change. The old labels were too small. Celtic was too simple. Ancient was too vague. British was too broad. Even Welsh, if treated like one single thing, missed the deeper pattern inside Wales itself. North and south, mountain and coast, Welsh-speaking and English-speaking, local and national, old and new. The DNA did not make Wales less Welsh. It made Wales harder to simplify. And maybe that is the real truth the science revealed. Not that identity is fake, but that identity is built in layers, spoken in one language, written in another, carried in families, shaped by borders, and altered by every century it survives. Somewhere on the western edge of Britain, the mountains still fold into the sea. The roads still narrow. The names on the map still remember older sounds. And the people there are not what the old story said they were. They are older than the label, more mixed than the myth, more continuous than the conquest. Not unchanged, not erased, still unmistakably Wales.